Welcome. Today we have a bit of a longer talk delving into the history of forensic science, particularly in relation to a time when the validity of evidence being presented in court came into question. What triggered this was a 2009 report authored by the National Academy of Sciences relating to forensic science. It was the early 2000s and all was not well. There had been growing suspicions that forensic science techniques weren't as infallible as they were being presented in court, and that serious questions about their validity were being overlooked. While this sense had been growing for about a decade, up until 2009, these concerns were being dismissed as coming from uninformed academics with nothing better to do than stir the pot. This lasted for a time until a report authored by the National Academy of Sciences made these dismissals untenable. Now, the report comes in the form of a book and it's 328 pages long. So a lot was said, but in a nutshell, looking at forensic science as a whole, they recommended that there needed to be an overhaul of the current structure, as well as implementation of national standards in terms of how forensic science was done and how it was presented in court as well. These ideas came up repeatedly and they came up for many different classes of forensic evidence. So fingerprints, fibres, tool marks, illicit drugs, the list goes on. They also asked for more federal funding, mostly to rectify the fact that there was very little underlying scientific analysis supporting key techniques, with the exception of DNA analysis. Now, as to who was actually making that pronouncement, it was a committee made up of scientists, legal experts, and medical experts, all having some knowledge of different types of forensic fields. Given the report had been released in 2009, the committee itself had been set up a couple of years earlier. Their goals were to hear expert testimony on the state of forensic science from experts in those fields, review the scientific literature that underpinned those areas, and as experts themselves in their own right, they also performed their own experiments to test the various ideas underpinning certain forensic concepts. In terms of the people who were being assessed, these largely were the scientific working groups that were associated with the different classes of forensic evidence. Most of these scientific working groups were formed before 2000. So, for example, SWAGFAST, which is the Scientific Working Group for Friction Ridge Analysis, Study and Technology, was formed in 1995. They're recognised by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and their membership is largely American scientists and forensic professionals, with a few internationals, mostly from the United Kingdom at the time. Their goal is to improve practice and refine forensic techniques. Now, I've listed the various scientific working groups over here, and as you can see, it covers pretty much all facets of forensic science. Most of these will have existed for a long period of time, although some, like digital evidence, may be more recent than 2000. So how are these scientific working groups being assessed? Well, in many ways, and there's a list A through P, and I'm going to summarise it. The questions the committee had were largely about, was scientific method being used? Were the forensic methods validated? Was further research being undertaken to improve those methods? What was the state of training and education for the forensic scientists undertaking the procedures? Was the evidence being presented appropriately in court? And is there uniformity of practice nationally around the United States, but also compared to international forensic science in the United Kingdom? Now, throughout their investigation, they made a distinction between two camps of evidence. One was the pattern experience evidence. So these are forensic techniques that look at matching patterns and often rely on the experience of the forensic professional when they make their assessment as to whether or not a match can be made. The second camp is the analytical kinds of evidence. So this includes fibres, DNA, paint, illicit drug, and biological fluid analyses. The main difference here is there is often some sort of instrumental technique that underpins interpretation of that evidence. So it's not a person sitting down looking at tool marks or bite marks or blood spatter or hair or handwriting going, yep, these two look the same. There is some sort of scientific technique underpinning the interpretation. So the first issues that arose were that there were big differences in how forensic science was being performed depending on the location of the forensic laboratory. So looking at the various providers all around America, they found vastly different levels of funding, different levels of training and expertise by the forensic practitioners doing the work, different instrumentation types being used to analyse evidence, and a large number of the forensic providers reported that their laboratories could be classed as under-resourced, with the exception being the federal providers of forensic science who had better resourced laboratories. Now, there are also some issues specific to certain forensic disciplines, wherein the way that evidence was being processed didn't have standardization, so different methods were used in different counties, states across the country. There was no uniformity in certification, so whether or not the laboratories or the practitioners were being certified to perform the work. Some cases they were, some cases they weren't. And in some jurisdictions, the laboratories didn't require accreditation at all. Now, that's not to say that there weren't standards that could be followed, but even when these standards were in place, the way that they were written was often vague, and there was no way of enforcing whether or not those methods would be used. And the culmination of this is that the quality of evidence being assessed and presented in court was wildly variable depending on where the work was being done. This led to deeper questions like, what even is forensic science? Is the work processing and interpreting the evidence being performed by scientists or law enforcement officers? These can have very different levels of education, with a scientist holding a PhD having at least 10 years of education behind them versus a law enforcement officer who maybe has a couple of weeks training on a specific kind of technique. Some classes of evidence benefited from very high levels of scientific development, like DNA analysis, others not so much, like toolmark analysis. To look at an excerpt from the report, simple reality was the interpretation of certain kinds of evidence wasn't always based on scientific studies. And some evidence types really lacked peer-reviewed published studies that showed that they were reliable. So should these less reliable classes of forensic evidence be admissible in court? Well, that question comes down to 2 points. Admissibility is governed by whether or not the evidence is based on a reliable scientific foundation, and this is what was being questioned by the report. The other factor being whether or not the evidence could be corrupted by error, human bias, or lack of proper procedures. And the report found that this error reporting or even considering error was in cases not done, and while there were often procedures that were recommended, these may not be followed. And all this culminates in whether or not the expert witness that testifies in court can be relied upon. There was also challenges with the language of how evidence was being presented in court. So, for example, it was quite common to hear terms like the evidence matched, it was consistent with, it was identical, etc., etc. Often these statements lacked any sort of discussion about the confidence that the expert witness had relating to the technique. No forensic method is 100% foolproof, but this level of uncertainty wasn't being conveyed. For example, a typical testimony that might be heard is the greenish-brown plant material in item 1 was identified as marijuana. And the problems with this is there's no mention of the methods whereby that identification was made, and there's no discussion or mention of the uncertainties in that identification. Another question that arose surrounded impartiality. If scientific and medical assessments were being performed by law enforcement agencies, can we expect them to be completely impartial when presenting their interpretation? It's law enforcement's job to charge people with crimes. So are they the ones you want performing the techniques that could exonerate you? Working in law enforcement, is there any pressure coming down on these people to sacrifice the methodology in order to get the results more quickly to help solve the case? What there should be is forensic scientists being independent of law enforcement administrators so that they can form their own impartial conclusions. For many kinds of forensic evidence, this wasn't what was happening. The report also broadly looked at certain kinds of forensic evidence. And one thing that they concluded was, with the exception of nuclear DNA analysis, there was a lack of support to give high degrees of certainty matching unknown items of evidence to known sources of that evidence. Now here, the analytically derived evidence had an edge over the pattern or experience-based forms of evidence interpretation. But even those that relied on pattern matching, certain classes of evidence benefited from more robust procedures than others. And just as a reminder, the pattern experience forms of evidence included fingerprints, firearms matching, tool marks, bite marks, blood spatter analysis, hair and handwriting analysis. These are ones that don't benefit from a scientific instrumental technique when forming conclusions. So the fight about admissibility played out in court, with historical precedents being provided by Fry versus the United States. This drew all the way back to 1923 and it involved the admissibility of lie detector tests involving a polygraph. Ultimately, the Frye Standard found that lie detectors were unreliable as a form of evidence because they didn't have general acceptance within the scientific community. And while that's a good call, the whole idea of what is generally accepted or not is really hard to nail down or define. Still, Frye was good enough for 50 years. But then in 1975, these rules of evidence admissibility were reassessed and a new version came into effect called Federal Rule of Evidence 702. And it provided that if a scientific, technical or other specialised knowledge will assist the trier of fact, so juries, a qualified expert in that science, technical technique or knowledge can testify to help out those people. They would be able to provide an expert opinion based on their expertise. So all you need to qualify for Rule 702 is to merely assist the trier of fact. If anything, this made things worse. And under Rule 702, all kinds of random evidence and experts were allowed to give their expert opinions in court, and this literally is the origin of the term junk science. It was a description of the kinds of evidence that were being presented in court, many of which had no foundation in scientific method or fact. And this led to another fight as to whether or not the Frye Standard or Rule 702 should be allowed to govern admissibility of evidence in court. And in 1993, Rule 702 won. This came about in a case Dorbert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, but it wasn't a complete victory. The case itself was a civil case against the pharma company for releasing a drug that caused birth defects in pregnant women. So if you know about thalidomide, this predates that and relates to a drug called bendectin, but it produced a similar scope of birth defects in the mothers that took them. Now, during that case, the drug company presented several expert witnesses to provide evidence that their drug was safe. In response, counter-experts were provided to rebut that evidence and say that no, in fact, bendectin was unsafe. But the pharmaceutical company decided to block those experts on the basis that their opinions was not established in the wider field. So essentially, those scientists' findings that the drug was unsafe was too new to be allowed in court. This was allowed, but then there were appeals, etc., and the final decision was that there needed to be some basis for reliability that was not whether or not it had been presented in court before. That would block any new kinds of evidence from finding their way into the court. And after discussions, fighting backwards and forwards, eventually the decision came that reliability could stem from whether or not what was being discussed could be tested or had been, whether it was subject to peer review or publication, whether there was a known measurable rate of error, whether there are standard operating procedures, or whether or not the technique had garnered acceptance from the wider scientific community. So there were multiple points whereby you could argue that evidence should be allowed. And this pretty much brings us to the modern day. So essentially, Rule 702 will apply, but it needs to be a flexible one that allows new kinds of evidence to find its way into the court system. The justification for this flexibility was that they didn't want to be strict on excluding evidence, and instead they'd rely on the adversarial nature of the system to weed out bad science. And what that means is you have a rigorous cross-examination of experts by lawyers to supposedly expose the charlatans, providing the bad science. The hope in all of this is that the juries will be able to spot the difference between good science and bad science, and personally I think this is a somewhat naive idea. You can look at climate change, for example, where the vast majority of scientists believe in it, but the wider public have different ideas as to whether or not it's valid. Now, one theme that sort of ran through the entire report was that DNA gets a pass. So why was that? Well, most of the problems we've discussed so far sort of stem from the ways that forensic evidence reporting developed over time. Typically, this was done by trial and error by law enforcement agencies coming up with ways to match certain kinds of evidence to the thing that produced that evidence. Now, DNA analysis was different. It wasn't developed within law enforcement, it was developed by scientists at universities. It was only later co-opted by criminal investigations to form matches between people and, say, blood or semen or different kinds of evidence. Because it was established in academia, there was a wide range of research, publications, etc. that backed up the validity of DNA analysis. And there was a public perception that DNA analysis was a cutting-edge science and it couldn't be wrong. By contrast, if we look at fingerprint evidence, that had been used in courts for more than 100 years at that point, so by no means was that considered cutting-edge science. So from its origins, DNA had an air of impartiality about it. The experts that were testifying in court were not law enforcement officers, they were scientists who had less of a vested interest in convicting people. Also, throughout the development of the DNA analysis, there was a lot of input from the private sector, which meant more money, more research, and more confidence in the final product. Now, fingerprints, which I would argue is a more important forensic technique, did not have this backing. And the case against fingerprints was that over the years the courts have admitted the evidence, but it lacked empirical validation of the underlying theories or the way that it was being applied. Now, there were counter-arguments made against this, including there was strong general acceptance that matching an unknown fingerprint to a perpetrator was a definitive match, and that cross-examination was a suitable tool to uncover shaky evidence. They also countered that this manner of forensic evidence had been used for more than 100 years at this point. Still, the strongest criticisms targeted the lack of underlying scientific methods in the way that fingerprint evidence had been established. And even I have to admit that there was a misconception that fingerprint evidence was infallible, and arguably this still happens today in court. And I'd put the blame for this largely down to historical fingerprint examiners overstating the confidence in the evidence that they were presenting. And this wasn't even particularly their fault, because examiners who would state their matches as being merely likely or probable or credible, they could face disciplinary action from their employers, given that they were law enforcement officers. So there was no incentive to provide explanation about errors or probability when they presented their evidence. Now, looking at some example testimony, which is actually somewhat balanced, the expert testifies that the error rate is essentially zero for finger mark matching. But they then go on to say that a small margin to error exists. However, this would be caught in peer review. So if you don't know, whenever a fingerprint is matched, that result needs to be confirmed by another fingerprint examiner. It's not just a single person making the match, there needs to be multiple ones reviewing the work to make sure that the result is correct. The expert then acknowledged that there wasn't a single standard for the procedure for matching a fingerprint, and also that in terms of what constitutes a match, each individual examiner forms their own comfort level as to whether or not they believe what they are seeing constitutes a match to a potential donor. The main court case where this played out was United States versus Crisp in 2003. Here it was pointed out that there was no studies supporting the reliability of fingerprint evidence, and that was the argument being made to undermine the match in that case. And this actually prompted action from the Scientific Working Group for Friction Ridge Analysis. And if we have a look over here, they did in fact come up with a set of standards for making conclusions about whether or not a fingerprint matches an unknown or an exemplar. So this was the case in 2003, and just as a comparison, here's what it looks like today. So as you can see, there is a whole flow chart covering each decision that needs to be made, covering the ACE-V, which is the analysis, comparison, evaluation, and finally verification method, ensuring that a fingerprint match is reliable. In what could be described as bad timing, in 2004 there was also a miscarriage of justice relating to fingerprint evidence in the form of the Madrid train bombing. The background was that terrorists detonated some bombs on a number of trains, ultimately killing 191 people in Spain. Included in that tally were a number of US citizens. The United States got involved with the case, and at a certain point, a bag was discovered containing detonators. That bag was processed for evidence, and a single partial fingerprint was found, which was then run through AFIS, the FBI database used to match fingerprints. AFIS found a potential match, and this was verified by FBI Special Agent Richard Verda. That match was against a US citizen, Brandon Mayfield, a civil and immigration lawyer who claimed to have not been in Spain at the time. But, based on the fingerprint evidence, he was arrested so that he couldn't flee before the grand jury had a chance to obtain his testimony. Later that month, though, the FBI had to release him and admit that they'd made a mistake in identifying Mayfield based on the fingerprint match. Now, the biggest error the FBI made, in my humble opinion, was to fixate on regions of similarity in the fingerprint without considering any areas of dissimilarity between the unknown and Mayfield's fingerprint. As I mentioned initially, the match was made by the automated fingerprint identification system, which at the time probably contained somewhere between 30 and 40 million fingerprints, including Mayfield's. Also, it wasn't like fingerprints didn't have standard operating procedures in place. They had the ACE-V system of analysis, comparison, evaluation and verification, which is still used today. All the equipment was calibrated and in working order. If the identification was based on less than 12 unique points in the fingerprint, you needed a supervisor's approval for the identification, and the verification process required multiple fingerprint examiners, at least 2, to verify the conclusions made. For those that are interested, this is the match that was made. If you have a look on the left, we've got the partial fingerprint that was found on the bag, while on the right we've got Mayfield's fingerprint that was found on the system. The terrorist fingerprint is a partial, and as you can see, there are many regions missing from the fingerprint. And the identification focused on this lower region down here, with very little done with these upper regions in the fingerprint. If we have a look at some of the supposed matches of specific minutiae drawn from both fingerprints, we can see that yes, some are all right. So if you have a look at these ones over here, maybe these ones up here, you could argue they are consistent. But some of the matches are very questionable, like say these ones or even this one over here. But regardless, charges were laid. Ultimately, a new suspect was identified in Spain, captured, and his fingerprints were checked, and they gave a true match afterwards. To compare Mayfield's fingerprint with the terrorists, focusing on the area that was actually looked at down here, there is a lot of similarity between the two fingerprints. They're both arches, they have quite similar minutiae in those regions, especially in the areas that are highlighted. But looking at some other areas of the fingerprints, for instance, the terrorist had scar tissue in the top third of his fingerprint, they are quite dissimilar. And this is why solely focusing on areas that match between an unknown finger mark and an exemplar fingerprint is not the best method. You need a holistic approach looking at the entire fingerprint, matching key areas, but also looking for areas of discrepancy. Now, this would have been challenging for the print that was found because it was only a partial and very few areas were available to do matching on. And this should have been a factor governing whether or not to arrest Mayfield. One thing to come out of this was there was a review of the different kinds of standards that were used to match fingerprints, a known and an unknown. 2 main standards were in use at the time, the rheology standards and the numerical standards. The FBI at the time was using the rheology standard, which is the study of the uniqueness of the friction-ridge structures and their use for personal identification. These identifications are based on quantitative and qualitative analysis as opposed to the old static collect a key number of minutiae that match, and when you have that number, you can declare it identical. This is what's done in the numerical standard based on a set key number of matching minutiae that you need, so 8, 12, 16, etc. And it's worth saying that the numerical standard approach has been rejected by SWIGFAST, the FBI, and other forensic laboratories in the United States, although it was still utilised in other countries. And a complication was that Spain used the numerical standard, typically with a minimum of 8 to 12 points of matching minutiae. And because this would have been a shared investigation between Spain and the United States, these conflicting standards would have come up against one another. And it's not like either one of the standards was like a fringe radical method. Both groups of standards had quite a number of adherents, and they would argue about which of the methods was better. So looking at the numerical standard people, they would say that rheology lacked objective criteria and that there's no assurance that different examiners will come up with the same result. They'd say that rheology had no statistical or experiential-based margins of safety, which could result in increased risk of misidentification. And they stated that rheology encouraged an increased reliance in level 3 details. Those are things like the width of the ridges and location of pores, and the validity of those types of observations are in dispute. But then the rheology people, they were saying that the numerical standards are based on little more than conjecture and that there's no formal scientific probability studies or validation justifying their point of view. They stated that the numerical standards omitted the clarity of the minutiae, and that is something that happened in this case. I think you'd agree that the clarity of some of those minutiae were incredibly hard to interpret. They also stated that the idea of merely counting minutiae tends to distract the examiner from the entirety of the print, including key information that could help them. And they also argued about level 3 details, stating that ignoring it was neglecting significant identifying power when making a match. Regardless, it was a miscarriage of justice, and the fallout from this mismatch between fingerprints led to a survey of fingerprint examiners within the FBI. Having spoken to many of them, they formed a consensus that, even with all the procedures in place, there would be one erroneous identification made every 11 years or so. Now, the scientific working group, focused on fingerprints, described these missed identifications as examples of human error, but it didn't represent a problem in the methodology or the scientific basis of the matching. This seems a little bit disingenuous though, considering how integral humans are with actually making a match. So we've talked about DNA and fingerprints. What about some of the other disciplines? So while the timing of the United States versus CRISP and the Madrid train bombing misidentification cast a shadow over fingerprint evidence, the silver lining was that it spurred considerable research into the methodologies and strengthened its scientific basis. And all of this improved its admissibility in court. Unfortunately, the same thing could not be said for some other disciplines of forensic science, particularly the areas of bite marks, firearm and tool mark identifications. So what came after the report? Well, it didn't end there. It spurred other investigations and a second report entitled Forensic Science in Criminal Courts, Ensuring Scientific Validity of Feature Comparison Methods, and this came out in 2016. It continued to look at whether or not there was a scientific basis for many forensic methods, and it was led by PCAST, which is the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. This is a group of eminent scientists given the job of advising the president, which had started in 1933 with Franklin D. Roosevelt's Scientific Advisory Board. But the one done in 2016 was convened by President Obama. You can think of PCAST as like a brains trust on matters of science and technology, seeing as the President of the United States may not be a scientist themselves. Their main job is to augment or interpret the science and technology advice that's made available to him inside the White House, often fed in from various federal agencies. PCAST also acts as a filter and an expert advisor to make complex matters understandable and allow decisions to be made about them. The findings of this second report would itself be a great topic for a talk. It was particularly scathing towards bite marks, firearms and tool mark identification. But it's probably best left for another day. That's all we have for today. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe.